Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
I hope you're drinking a Pepsi.
How do you feel? I'm pouring, I'm not even using the can.
Okay, good.
It's not a Pepsi
It's
product.
not a Pepsi product.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I get to speak with Deepika Yerragunta. Deepika is the head of e-commerce platform products at PepsiCo. Prior to that, she ran platform products at Intel, as well as led product for the team at Amazon that brought Alexa to our TVs. I love her advice on how to thrive at the enterprise, especially if you're a leader in product or technology that's transitioning from a role in a pure technology company into a technology-enabled company at a more traditional industry like supply chain or manufacturing or CPG. We talk about how a culture of customer obsession and a product mindset lead to both customer and stakeholder delight that drive business growth and outcomes, even when your peers aren't necessarily experienced technologists. We also get to talk about the management by objective system over at Intel and how they form the foundation for OKRs, some of Deepika's best practices and advice on implementing OKRs, as well as some of our gripes or pet peeves on OKR theatrics and the box checking exercise that it can sometimes be. Deepika is one of the most engaged and fun guests that I've gotten to host on the show. She brings a lot of great stories from her experience at some really strong companies and has been super thoughtful to distill them and synthesize them into actionable insights for us. I got to learn a lot from her. I'm sure you will too, and you'll get to try a few things out tomorrow at work. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Hi, Deepika. I've been so excited to have you on.
Happy to be here.
So why don't we start with some of the history on how did you get into product management? Most people didn't go to product management school. So what's your path there?
Yeah, it was a fairly traditional path. I did my undergrad and master's in computer science, and I learned very quickly at Intel. I developed these proof of concepts in a technology called wireless sensor networks way back when. And as I worked with different industry vertical leaders and understood the business problems and how tech could be applied to those, I was bringing a lot of feedback into the product teams itself at Intel. And that was the first time I understood that there was a role called product management, right? So this is way back in 2006, 2007, when even I think Google hadn't even coined the term product management. And I got into product management almost by accidentally discovering that I wasn't a very good engineer. But here was where I could bridge the gap between business and technical needs and define this role called product management. So that's how I got in.
And you are at Pepsi now. And, what's interesting there is you mentioned Google hadn't coined the term yet. I think it's in the CPGs that I'd seen the term product manager well before you saw it in software, right? If you're building a new shampoo or something like that, there's someone needs to work with the chemists and the marketing team and test the product before it gets out there. And that's kind of my first recollection when I was put into a similar role of what should we call my role? So you've worked at Amazon, at Intel, and now a very, very popular household name, even more so than Amazon and Intel at PepsiCo. And you've gotten to do product management at a number of different companies. So talk to me about what that's like at Pepsi.
Yeah. So number one with Pepsi, I think, is just the idea that, we're bringing smiles to people. We take it very seriously, right? That's the mission. And it is true, right? Any party I go to, any event I go to, the moment I say I work for Pepsi, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So there's a huge amount of gratification that comes with it. But immediately they're like, wait, you're in tech at Pepsi? That's the follow-on question. And I think that makes total sense too, right? So coming from a very West Coast kind of mentality where we've led and built engineering led products, and to come to the East Coast where it's very business forward, and the product that the company is known for is something completely different from technology, and we play almost that support role, if you will, in actually taking the main product and spreading it around the world, right? Having said that, I think one of my biggest realizations in interacting with most people on the East Coast, and I've been here only 3 years since the pandemic, this entire time I've been at Pepsi, is the realization that if we don't believe that every company, right, whether it's a hospital or a bank, is a tech company, we're all missing the point, right? That's the world that we are slowly moving into, and I think it's time that we started to think about technology-led businesses as opposed to businesses, leading technology.
You're transitioning probably from a cost center to a profit center at a CPG like that. And that's definitely a big transition for the board as well as the CFO's office to kind of start thinking about those investments having financial returns versus just cost reduction or risk mitigation. And so from that lens, maybe talk to me, there's a lot of folks that I know now are considering switching similarly to yourself from pure tech companies or tech startups into being major players in tech roles at non-tech or traditionally non-tech companies. And so what are some things I think they should consider about, maybe both sides, or what are some things you're really enjoying that you didn't think about when you were at pure tech companies?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things that I always think about is, the company gets made in the image of the leaders that you hire, right? So if you want to be thinking about transitioning your company into a more tech forward company, considering the multipliers that technology brings on an everyday basis, then you need to figure out where your weaknesses are. Let's say I'm the CEO of a company here. What would I be doing? I would be hiring a CTO or a CPTO or a CPO coming from that world and mindset that can bring true innovation to every aspect of how I think about my business, right? And that might not be my strength, but it's important to find those people that can bridge that gap between business and tech very, very seamlessly and be not daunted by the business, right? Because even when I joined Pepsi, I knew nothing about supply chain, right? I had some basic understanding. And as I basically worked more and more closer to my business stakeholders, and they allowed me the leeway of saying, please come sit at this table, understand my problems. Together, we built a partnership in trying to figure out how to actually build these large deployable solutions and platforms, right? And that is, I think, the crux of how to think about, bringing somebody new into this world, or if you're trying to transition into this world, try to use your business empathy and your customer empathy to be able to say, okay, I understand how AI works or how ML works or how IoTs work, right? And then how can I look at the business and say, what do I not know about the business? So make your business partners, right? Like at Pepsi, my supply chain partners were my closest allies. And then we built a real partnership and building out large solutions. So I think these are some of the things to think about, right? Building trust and credibility with your partnership is extremely important. So, yeah.
So this is a very common issue that I've seen working at Integral, is that we're oftentimes working on behalf of the technology teams to earn more trust and influence in a sustainable way rather than through authority, and being invited to that table. And it sounds like you already got invited. Was there any sort of, even speaking very tactically, what are some tips you'd give someone who is struggling to earn that influence and finds themselves not being invited to things where they could maybe really make a difference or even learn some things?
Yeah. I think that, I'm smiling because, it sounds like it was easy, but it truly wasn't, right? Everybody is, responding to the business needs of their day to day. And then you come in and you have the, hubris to believe that you're going to come in and change everything dramatically, right? And they have a business and a P&L to respond to, right, on a daily basis. So in the interim, you're this pesky little person asking all these questions. They don't have time to answer it, right? So I had to take a big step back. This happened at Pepsi for sure. That we had to take a big step back and say, what is it that we can do to build that credibility and communication first, right? So I think that's one big takeaway that I'd offer to the listeners. It is, first try and focus on building your credibility within the organization, right? And the best way to build credibility is performance, right? Build out one or two things that immediately solve somebody's need and get to those milestones quickly, right? Somebody very senior once gave me great advice, and he said, the first thing that you need to do when you get into this kind of environment is have a few quick wins in the first 60 days that you're there, right? Get 2 quick wins. And I took that advice very seriously and executed on, trying to solve some immediate problems. When we did that and continually communicated back to the business users in forms of presentations or, reaching out milestones, here's the schedule, and then stuck to the schedule and responded, immediately light bulbs went off, right? It was so much more like, oh, here's something, you saved me 8 hours of work. Now you're actually, my people are able to do something better with this time. And then the next time I had an ask, the answer was still a no, but a far less reluctant no, right? And then I think from there on, we started building, brief steps to like try and accomplish that roadmap together and define common goals and so on. So change management, I think, is one of the most critical pieces that people underestimate. And, we were talking about this earlier, right? Soft power is everything. When you have no authority, how do you build influence in an organization is a whole lesson in itself, right? Like I did this course at Wharton. This is literally my last term, and the course is called Influence by Kate Massey. If you guys can get hands on it, like I think it's on one of these online portals. It's excellent. It's about how do you build influence in an organization. We have politics, right? But it's like how do you circumvent politics in a more thoughtful way as opposed to a negative, kind of reaction towards it. So I would encourage everyone to follow those guidelines.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product design or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. I think we've heard about this building trust and credibility, or the difference between relationship building and politics. And what it sounded like you were doing there was taking a little bit of a product mindset there, right? Building some quick wins and starting small and identifying what the biggest pain points were to choose which wins you were going after. So I like that you're combining like more traditional, conventional knowledge with a product mindset in your role and thinking about your internal customers so that you can collaborate to win with your external customers.
Yeah, I think, funnily enough, if you take the fundamentals of product management, it can be applied to pretty much anything, right? It can be applied to your career, your relationships, your life, and anything. So I think you nailed it. Like, approaching it in a large organization requires a lot of thoughtful planning. And I think that's where we followed some basic principles there.
You mentioned supply chain a few times, and many lives ago, I got to work in manufacturing and supply chain in IoT. And it wasn't even, that term IoT hadn't really even come around back then, right? Uh-huh. So I'd love to know now what some of those things you're really excited about are. I'm sure AI and data play a much bigger play than it did 15 years ago. So what's exciting for you in that space?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So as we move into this environment, and I think suddenly we saw COVID gave a lot of resurgence to people becoming used to getting things quickly delivered to them at any given point in time, which meant that your supply chain had to be resilient to be able to respond to changing demand and needs, right? So in order to build something like that very quickly and very fast and have a responsive system, you can imagine the large volumes of data and patterns that have accumulated over the years that can be leveraged for something like AI or machine learning, right? We can't hire fast enough. We can't build fast enough to be able to think about how to make this more and more efficient. Number one, that's the big thing behind let's say, an autonomous supply chain. But the second part is, how can you think about making it so good that it becomes your strength and you can actually leverage it to make more money, right? So that, I think, is where these are sort of the fundamental principles that I constantly remind myself of, that how are we building this into this scalable platform that we can actually think about the future needs without even having to think about it, right? Like if something else happens tomorrow, are we in any position to actually respond to it? Now, where AI and ML comes into the picture, and this is the beauty of these technologies, right, is that we are so resource constrained that these technologies used appropriately can actually act as multipliers into how we are doing actions today, right? Whether it's planning, forecasting, thinking about distribution, logistics, schedule management, any one of these areas can be done so much better and so much faster if we start out optimizing with various variables that we already have enough data for. Now, introduce things like machine learning to it, now you're able to pick better predictive decisions. And those, I think, become very interesting when you think about core, extremely hard topics to tackle, like, supply planning or demand planning or, forecast accuracy and things like that. So I feel like as the next decade unfolds, we're going to see more and more, both in terms of infrastructure in gathering that data and making that data integral and clean to the environment that can utilize it. But also, too, we'll see immediate applications that will be built on top of it that might leverage these technologies to get us to the finish line faster. So I'm very excited. And I think that we're just merely scratching the surface today by creating, automation. But I think in 10 years from today, we will see fully stabilized autonomous supply chain systems come to fruition.
This is it's very reminiscent of when I worked in mobile a lot, where you look at companies' priorities or executive priorities, and they're all very business or customer related. And then there'd be one ambiguously named bullet point just called figure out mobile.
Yeah.
And, I'm seeing this now again, where there's a lot of business or customer things where you can predict for auto company or CPG. This makes sense as to why this on it. And then I'm also saying figure out AI. And
yeah.
If we were to think like product people, identifying core areas, and you touched on a few there, and prioritizing them is one. And so I'm wondering if you have any stories or any advice in terms of, there's this new thing that's got an ambiguous bullet point. How do you go about prioritizing at a more traditional company, where to invest, where to not invest, or do we invest everywhere and see what sticks? Like what's your take on that?
Let me address a more high level question, right? Why do we prioritize anything? You prioritize because you have constraints, right? You have either resource constraints, right? Human beings at the job, or money, right? And these are legitimate constraints that everyone has. That's when you think about prioritization, right? And then in all the things that you could be pursuing, why this one first over something else, right? This is something to do with both your market analysis and also your own business needs, right? So it always comes back to, I think, the basics of product management, which is what's your goal? What is your goal, right? Is it to reduce your wastage by 10%, or is it to grow your revenue by 100 million, right? Identifying that, then trying to put down constraints around it, then saying how do I take whatever I'm building into these constraints into consideration, is how you think about prioritization. Now, you asked me a really good question, which is, in the list of things that use AI to build something, no one cares, right? You care and I care because we are technologists. But if you truly think about the business of CPG, let's say, they don't care. Ultimately, what do we care about? We only care about the customer, right? The customer obsession is the number one thing. The customer should get the right product in his hands at the right time, at the right price. That's all the ultimate goal is. How we solve that problem using what technology, where, machine learning, optimization model, AL, no one really cares. That's all a black box, right? Those are the those are the truth fundamentals, right? I can sit here and brag all I want about like, oh, we built a fuzzy matching algorithm for like catalog, data. No one cares. All they want to see is did we have the most accurate results at any given point or not, right? How we get to it fastest. I'm sorry, I know that's not that's not a word, but we get to it very quickly, but also by using the least amount of resources is what we are trying to aim at. And that's where I think AI comes into the picture, right? That's where my investment in data science comes into the picture, because I know that I'll get better results and more accurate results. Instead of putting 10 people to solve some data ops problem, now I wrote a fuzzy matching algorithm to actually do some matching. And then we had some exception handling that we built in-house, right? So that's how I think about these things, like the AI component of it is just the how, but it's not the what of it. So, yeah.
How I'm almost re-envisioning that deck of executive priorities is that AI shouldn't be one of those bullet points. It should maybe be, hey, you've done great to whittle down your top priorities and your strategy down to these points. Now at a sub-bullet point of how can AI help you with this? And AI is not a destination. And I think that's a question that came up with autonomous vehicles as well, which is in a similar, at least from a technical space, a similar challenging problem to solve. But really it's what's the better customer experience? What does your balance sheet look like or your P&L statement look like differently if you have a much more efficient way to have someone drive these vehicles instead of having a human driver, and the same way here. So I love that. And of course, any technologists that have gone into the business side or invited to the business rooms, there's a risk we play of earning that, gold star or Boy Scout badge for saying, hey, we used AI for this, when you want to look at your peers and say, hey, if we're able to move the needle on this thing from A to B, how excited or of a difference would that make for you or not, and facilitate that conversation that maybe you talked about earlier of building that trust and credibility, right?
Yeah, I love that. AI is a strategy, right? So I'm going to steal that for my other podcasts, I think.
Fair enough. You mentioned customer obsession a few times. And so naturally, I want to talk about your role at Amazon, where we've maybe heard that most publicly in terms of leadership principles and culture, and maybe also Intel. So let's talk about culture, right? Both of those companies, as a founder, as a leader, Netflix, Amazon, Intel are probably some of the cultures that are very strong and opinionated. And I'm curious, having been in there and also founding a business, working at bigger companies where they look at culture differently if they're not necessarily a tech company. What's your opinion on those really strong, opinionated cultures?
Yeah, I think that, it's so like wonderful to like look back, because in the moment I didn't really appreciate it, enough. And then when I'm out in the real world, I appreciate it so much more. So I always say that the biggest business school that I've ever gone to is Intel, right? Intel, being a monopoly business, had its core fundamentals so strong when I was there that we had the luxury of doing everything by process and doing it right? And we were also building a multi-billion-dollar hardware product. Like you can't, push down some more code and change it. Once it's built, right? And it's a public company. So that kind of engendered a lot of discipline into how a lot of thought was put into, building product even before like one line of code or one, chip was even built, right? And so that was, I think, my first grounding in how to think about the core principles of product management. And customer obsession was sort of number one at both these companies, right? Intel and Amazon. And I think at Amazon, the idea that customer obsession exists in every aspect of what we did was almost like a unshakable tenet. That means that as if you and I had a disagreement, that's totally fine. But what is right for the customer, we would always go back to that, and then that would help us dispute any of these issues that we had, right? So culture wise, I think things that I still take and repeat to this day, right? A few things. Number one is the idea that you manage by objective. That helped with a company like Intel, which is you have these large goals and objectives at the top. You break it down into smaller goals and then break it down into further goals. And then finally, each individual in the organization knows exactly what their operating plan is, so to speak, right? What are they executing on day to day? And those little drops of water actually move that big needle, right? Like, and that's, I think, was a very core principle that, MBOs was started by Andy Grove, and then, Google took it over. That was popular as OKR system, and now we have it at Pepsi as well. We use the OKR system to help communication, right? What is in the roadmap and why is it not shakable? And because we all agreed upon it sitting in one room, right? So I think that whole piece is one big culture shift that I think I've actually brought in from my own previous experiences. The second is thinking about how you think about customer obsession and communicating both in your peers, communicating upward and communicating downstream, like in how you actually think about what that means. What does customer obsession translate to, right? It's data driven, right? What is the customer desiring? It's qualitative, right? You're also thinking about what else can we put in there which is not truly quantifiable as a result, but you've spoken to somebody and you've gotten like enough information that. And I think the third thing is, I would call it product sense or your gut, right? Which is like, what is your product gut saying? I always bring it back to the iPad design, right? So when the iPad came out, you already had your iPhone and you had your MacBook. Why did you need an iPad, right? If you truly did like actual focus groups or like data driven studies on it, you wouldn't get any really relevant data points. But somebody had enough product sense and gut to believe and say, nope, there is a white space here. Let's go build this larger product that's going to get us to the another $1 billion in revenue. I think those are like fundamental things that, I constantly think about and encourage my product managers to think about. How do you think about like, the impact that you're going to have based on all these three things, right? And continue to develop those through different resources. So culture-wise, I think those were very hard cultures to be in, right? Amazon, Intel. But I think as I evolved, like I understood the value of some of the core things that we got into arguments about or built, but ultimately we would build the right products. And I think those are the core principles that I apply to my own startup building. And then finally, like smaller companies that I worked at, like Marketron, and today at Pepsi.
You've touched on some really interesting points that can also become kind of fads, right? Or trends. OKRs is maybe kind of riding a wave right now. And with most trends, you see folks maybe understanding it at a very, maybe relatively shallow capacity and trying to scale it in a very broad sense. And I'm curious to know, having worked at Intel, and I'm going to go on a tangent. So high output management is how I'm a huge fanboy of Andy Grove, and that's kind of how I've gotten my window into Intel. Is there anything else you would recommend I go, like as a fanboy, go learn up on in terms of Intel culture and systems?
I think there used to be this principle which was disagree and commit. And I think that we don't do enough of that in the real world, right? Like, which is we state our opinions, we try to do the right thing. But finally, when you agree that this is what you're going to develop, that's what you want to corral and rally your troops around, and everybody has to align, right? And commit to it. So I think that principle and how you adapt it to what you were talking about, which is high outcome driven thinking, requires some fast decision making, right? We can all sit in multiple process meetings and discuss strategy till our faces are white, but like you don't want to be there, right? You want to get to faster decision making, but ultimately make decisions and start to build things and start to like have measure yourselves against like an outcome and then continue to iterate on that. I think it's a little bit contradictory, right, in trying to drive both efficient process, but also at the end of the day you want to achieve high outcome goals. But I think it's important to like make these kind of principles of disagreeing and committing a part of your overall ethos in how you drive product thinking.
So I know I took us on the tangent, so I'll bring us back. OKRs as a trend. Are there things that you find yourself having to sort of put guardrails around or remind folks around the intent around OKRs? What are some like common things that you think people are maybe getting wrong about OKRs?
I think that, some of the goals are not measurable, right? Sometimes it's just not measurable. Like until I build 4 things, I'm not able to go and be able to truly measure the impact of it. And we're going through some of that right now in my current roadmap planning, right? Some of them are just core capabilities that have to be lit up, like in supply chain, for example, right? Like inventory management, getting real-time inventory data is the most important thing. How do you measure the success of that, right? And if you harp too much on measuring the success of it, you're losing the point. So assigning the differences between strategic impact and measurable impact and like improving hours saved or revenue or things like that has to be separated out and measured accurately. Otherwise, it's like, oh, I can't do this until this feature is lit up, but the feature is not lit up, it's taken 5 months. Somebody has to measure why the velocity of it was so slow, right? And so how do you actually still manage to define it, whether it's an OKR or in any other way, but for strategic goals, have some kind of, point system or something to tell you whether you're actually meeting the goal, or are you stuck, or are you unblocked, or, do you need unblocking and things like that. So I think that people should think about that. The second thing is measurement, constantly kind of iterating and measuring. Sometimes, everyone is busy, heads down doing work. You look like you're doing work, right? The engineering teams are definitely driving the sprints, but then you get to the end of the quarter and you haven't met your KR because there were delays. That should be surfaced up sooner, right? Bring in retros, bring in like things like other processes where you're constantly having a milestone check in between and you're not waiting until the KR hasn't been met and then you're trying to like measure yourself, because at that point you've already done 6 sprints, right? So you've missed the point. Like you want to be able to like get control of the situation much earlier on than waiting for the end result to show up.
I have had to, I'll say, advise, coach, facilitate going from a dashboard of over 30, 40 metrics at an executive level and really having those hard discussions to whittle them down to a few things that are really important, and also helping define the context between what's important to the business. But firstly, what are we solving for the customer and how do we measure that? What are some of the more technical reliability things? And sometimes we end up with new gauges and graphs than we started out with. And it's a hard conversation. So whether at a pure play tech company or especially at a non-traditional tech company, what are some of those conversations like in terms of determining what should go on those analytics dashboards?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether you're building an internal product or an external product, or you're building a consumer product or a B2B product, right? So all of those things are very different when it comes to metrics, right? And how you can plan for it. I think somebody needs to write a book just purely on metrics, because I think it's a whole topic in itself. But when I think about the differences, right? Amazon was a large consumer company. Alexa was like a huge product. How do you think about success there versus like how we think about it right now at Pepsi, or how do we think about it at Intel is very, very vastly different, right? So I think that it boils down to truly you can't optimize for every metric on the planet. So what is that what are the 1 or 2 metrics that you can think about that you're ultimate goal breaks down into, right? That's what you need to think about. What is the proxy that will move that goal? And, if it's revenue, and if I'm thinking, I don't know, average, like hours saved, then does it actually translate into a goal for my revenue? Maybe not. But if it's like number of orders filled, right, in my case, then it's something that is a proxy for my revenue goals, right? So you have to really force those conversations. And I think the biggest leading metrics is what you need to focus on, right? Because we can't optimize for everything. Once you have that at the highest level and everyone is aligned in the organization that those are the 2-3 things, and I would only put it down to 1 or 2 things. It wouldn't be more than that, right? Because it's impossible to track that. Then each of your pods or each of your product teams then can take that goal and then break it further down and then have their own trailing metrics that would have an indicator towards that leading metric, right? That's, I think, how you would think about it in a large way. At Amazon, we would review it every week. We would review it with our entire leadership. We'd have vice presidents. We'd have different executive levels sitting in a room together, 20, 30 people, and we would review it, right, every Monday. We had a full team dedicated to analytics and measurement, right? And in other organizations, it's much smaller. The product manager itself is also doing the measurement and presenting that in terms of success or not, right? But they are trying to put it into place as they're even building product on how are you going to measure success. Maybe you don't even have a baseline to see if you have improved it or actually decreased it, right? So bringing visibility into those metrics is also one of the first steps that people should do, and then think about how can I continuously measure myself, because you can launch 1,000 experiments, but if you don't know how you're impacting the end goal that you want, then you shouldn't be doing that at all, right? That shouldn't be a initiative that you should even be wasting time on. So
that makes a ton of sense. And I think you mentioned the differences even within Amazon based on the life cycle of the product. And if we zoom out the life cycle of a business, where Amazon's a much newer company to Pepsi, for example, and at a Pepsi, you're building maybe part of the transition towards building more consumer grade technology compared to enterprise applications that help run the business before, versus have more customer or partner interactions. And so do you find yourself enabling or coaching your stakeholders on the differences between building tech before versus now because the audience is different?
Yeah, constantly, right? In fact, I think a few times over, we've had the discussion of what is product management, right? Why are you guys even important? Who are you, right? And I've never had to do that in my West Coast career, right? Because product management is one of the pivotal roles when it comes to technology companies. But in a CPG company, it's who are you? Why should I listen to you? And taking them back onto the iterative approach that we take, right? The idea that, hey, I'll build an MVP and then the MVP will be iterated into a full product. No one has the time for that, right? If you're looking to replace the system here, an MVP is only going to take into consideration some of the core, features, but that's not enough to replace this person. Now this person who's operating has to use 2 different systems to do their job. So they view it as more of a nuisance than actually a benefit. But repeated kind of conversations, repeated presentations, and explaining how we are actually thinking about it. What is the sort of end of the tunnel? And then working backwards, right? Another principle that I got from Amazon, working backwards from your end goals and laying it down and breaking it down into, we'll build this, we'll give this to you by the end of June. After that, the idea is to expand into this, and this by the end of September. Now you'll have a full picture. I think communicating over and over again has been becomes almost central to how we operate. But I will say that it comes to the top of the leadership, right? If you have executive support in an organization, in a large organization, and the desire to make that change, then you'll see that trickle down across the organization as well. And I think we have that at Pepsi.
One of the things that comes to mind there is that conversation at the beginning around why are you here? Why isn't it just the engineers, right?
Right.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. What is an answer that's worked well for you to explain to, especially, I imagine the technologists probably know, but imagine that business stakeholder who has just been crushing it at supply chain, and they're like, who are you and why are you part of this meeting? What's a way that you explain the importance of product management or your role there?
I think that, I remember literally the first meeting that I did, right, at Pepsi. It was, I think, literally week 1, day 2 or something like that. And I had to take over something and present, right? And I said, I hear these are your problems and I want to help solve them. And this is the picture that I think that we need, right? So I laid it out. I broke it down in terms of like schedule. And I said, here's like what we would build and this is what we would learn. And there were lots of skepticism in the room. I could sense it, right? But the more, I think the role of a product manager is really funny, right? It's like you're the CEO of the product. You'll hear that a lot, but no one says you're the servant of the product as well, right? You're the servant of the customer that you're there to serve pretty much all the time, right? So you're the gopher. And so I think the humility of admitting that, hey, I don't know everything about supply chain, but here's what I think I'm hearing you say. And here's, I think, how I'll help you solve this problem. Can you give me more information, right? It's a funny thing that I learned later in life, which is how does a politician befriend somebody, right? The politician befriends somebody by asking them for a favor, by not doing them a favor, right? So when you ask the questions and you say, hey, can you help me do this? And you give that person the importance that they have acquired, because, hey, they've done it for 25 years. Who are you? Like, you're coming into the picture, like, and you're saying that you're going to build something and you know nothing about this. So that humility to admit and say, I don't know what I don't know, but I have the best intentions. I'm here to help. I think that really shifted the conversation. But the humility had to be demonstrated adequately, right? So a few techniques that I've used is meeting before the meeting, right? So you have a big executive meeting, don't go into it all guns blazing. Have the meeting with the right stakeholders before, right? In the old world, you would have the water cooler conversation. You'd go up and introduce yourself over the water cooler and then have a quick chat. In the post-COVID world or during the COVID world, I joined Pepsi during COVID. There is no chance of doing that. What side conversation am I going to have with anyone, right? And so it took a lot to build that rapport to make these more serious and intense conversations a lot more palatable.
Very cool. So you were thrown something very early. You understood the problem to the best as you could,
as I could
at the time. Mm-hmm. Formed an opinion. You were intentional about how you communicated it. And then I think that last tip about humility and the anecdote about the politician, something I'm definitely going to try and test out, of asking for the favor, because it shows that you don't think you're complete and full and you need help. And maybe people are kind of more willing to help than take help.
Always, right? And that's the fundamental truth of human nature that I think in product management plays a really good role.
So counterintuitive in my head for some reason. So you mentioned Amazon a few times, and we didn't really get into what you were doing there. So talk to me about what you got to work on.
Yeah, so when I joined Amazon, I was a total fangirl, right? So I had heard about this product called Alexa. It was the speaker that you could speak to and it would respond back to you. So for me, that lit up something in my head, and I said, wow. So now the 4 billion people who are not using the computer, right, not comfortable using the QWERTY keyboard, will potentially use their voice to communicate with technology. And what amazing doors will that open, right? And that was very exciting to me as a vision. And when I joined Alexa, it was with the ambition that we would bring Alexa into every household by enabling TVs with Alexa, right? So I was brought in to build the product strategy and vision for how to execute and roll out Alexa into TVs. And think about it, right? There are 800 million TVs today in the United States alone. And pushing down some software down the wire, or like putting it on a satellite somewhere and getting your TV to connect to Alexa in the cloud, you're able to now turn your TV into the what I call the operating system of your household.
Inside a company like Amazon, how does something get greenlit before it comes to you? And then maybe from there I can come back to this, but segue into what you learned about how product strategy looks like at Amazon.
Yeah, such a good question, because I wish that more companies thought about innovation as a culture, right? Everyone talks about innovation, and innovation is something that we bring it as an afterthought. There's a team that does innovation. Like, you'll hear this so many times. Oh, I was in the innovation team at AT&T, right? But to take what the innovation team builds and bring it back into the business is almost like an impossibility, because again, change management, culture shift, so on. Amazon is the, I think, biggest example of how innovation should be part of the DNA of every team, right? When you talk about Amazon and you say, "Oh, I want to compete against Amazon," which part of Amazon? Amazon is 1,500 companies combined into one, right? Every team had a startup mentality. We worked in silos intentionally, like you were a startup without any hindrance in moving as fast as possible, right? And the biggest thing there, the artifacts, frankly, were the six-pager document, right? This infamous six-pager document, and I'm sure you've heard about this innumerable times, was the idea that you were a startup founder and Deepika build $100 million business for me, and I am the VC, right? And I will hear your pitch out, ask you all the hard questions, and then if I like it, I will give you enough money to go start a two pizza team, right? The term two pizza team is how many people can eat two pizzas, which is about 10 people. So that was sort of the fundamental, plan, right? But of course, there were like variations of this. The six-pager document was never a six-pager document, right? It was written as a PR FAQ. So it would start with a press release, followed by 3 FAQs written from the customer's perspective, the engineering or development team or perspective, and then lastly the partner perspective, depending on what perspectives you needed that weighed in on building that product.
And what does partner mean in this context?
In this context, for example, TV manufacturers could be a partner, right?
Got it. Understood.
Yeah. So this idea that you want to answer the topmost questions on anybody's mind forced you to build products that only somebody would buy, right? So, onboarding, for example, how would I enable Alexa in my TV? Like, that could be a question on my FAQ document. And in order to answer that, I have to now have a detailed plan on what are the requirements for that onboarding experience. Is it like a, CAPTCHA? Is it a phrase? Is it a code that I get to my phone? I have to really think through these things. I have to work with engineering. I have to work with design. I have to have the most seamless experience, right? And so that's the rest of your strategy. Some of these documents took me 4 or 5 months to write and get approved. But it showed you that before we made any investment, every possible thing that we could analyze and kind of remove, right? Any assumptions that you were making, where you qualified those assumptions and you said, great, I tried to answer it to the best I could by talking to a partner. They gave me these answers. I'm satisfied with these 2 data points, but I don't know what the rest of the market will say, right? And stating all your assumptions up front was amazing. I mean, some of these documents ran to 36 pages, I won't lie. But the fact was you answered every possible question there was and had a lot of confidence in building these products. And, at the time that I was at Amazon, I think there were 5,000 product managers. And I will say that it was a very strong product management-led company. And so I think that allowed for a lot of innovation to happen organically through different aspects of the company itself.
I imagine most of the folks listening have used Alexa or have it on their TVs. What are any stories that come to mind of like surprising challenges about putting software on TVs?
Oh my God. It was a total nightmare, right? But a core strategy was you could go after, and I think any big strategy for existing incumbent products it's a very different ballgame when you do 0 to 1 and 1 to 100, right? So I was at a crossroads on, do you go and enable TVs through your MVPD providers, that's your cable providers, right? Your Comcast and those guys. Or do you go after the hungry smart TV manufacturers that were like, hey, I'll put in like 200,000 units as opposed to your Comcast with like maybe, let's say, I don't know, tens of millions of customers. But that would take a longer cycle. That would take a year and a half before you got it in. And this would take maybe 2 months. So how do you make those trade-off decisions? And then how do you actually, act fast? I think that was a huge revelation for me that, it felt like I was making these right decisions, but, you had to consider that most people, including leadership, anywhere, executive leadership, has very little patience, right? Everyone talks a good game of a 5-year strategy. I always say that at most, if you're blessed, you have an 18-month, runway to prove everything out, to build something that's revenue generating. If not, the project gets killed, right? And I saw this happen repeatedly at Intel. I saw this happen at Amazon. I saw this happen at every company. So my best takeaway from that experience is please build time to market, like build something that works and put it out there immediately and focus on speed versus trying to build like a huge long-term strategy.
That's amazing. And I'm assuming the takeaway there was you ended up prioritizing the hungry TV manufacturers over the network providers, right?
I mean, I'm not going to say anything, but
fair enough.
Yeah.
I'd like to switch gears here. And we've gotten to hear a lot about your insights and expertise as a product expert. And I want to hear a little bit about as a product leader and a manager of people. You and I have had similar backgrounds in terms of how we arrived into product by starting out in engineering. And I've hired a ton of folks who haven't written code before. And I'm curious to know, what are some things that you tend to look for in product managers when you're hiring them?
Like product management in different companies, again, different things, right? So my thinking is the general idea for most engineers, right? Engineers can build anything, right? You can write a bunch of code and you can start building things without needing anything. Similar designers, right? Designers also can design a bunch of things without actually truly like waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. The role that product managers play is in prioritization. Why are you building what you're building? And how fast can you build it and how cheaply can you build it, right? That's the thinking that somebody needs to keep an eye on and is able to connect all the dots to come out with a big picture. Now, there are two types of product managers, right? One is somebody who's very good at the tactical stuff, very good at execution, and you're able to build rapidly, work with engineers, put the Jira stories together, put a Jira board together, and keep executing. The other type of product manager is a strategic thinker, right? More visionary, more big picture. And if you can get both these qualities in one human being, absolutely wonderful, right? But if you cannot, then you have to think about how your team is structured and optimize for the best that you can hope. Certain products, I think, that require core business insights and expertise, right? So supply chain, for example, is a great example, right? I don't know anything in supply chain, but that was also somewhat of my strength because I didn't know. As I learned, I would ask some core questions. Why is this done this way, right? And that became like an impetus. Oh, we did it because we always did it this way. We didn't know any better. And then I would bring in a perspective. But what I needed was for somebody to have worked in supply chain for a number of years and having some unique insights that I couldn't have. So optimizing for core business knowledge and then saying product management can be taught to this person is, I think, one way of hiring, right? But fundamentally, I think three qualities that I look for is, are you curious, right? Is there a core curiosity that you have, that you're not just taking everything for granted and just putting your head down and doing it? Two is, are you an active listener? Meaning you're asking a question, but the answer is not about the question. It's being about, what am I not saying, right? And playing the detective in that conversation and going after those little things. Mean always keeping in the back of your mind, what's the business goal I'm trying to achieve? Oh, wait, why am I building order management software when I should be building something else, right? Like having that conversation with yourself constantly. And three is this absolute ruthless ability to prioritize, right? The prioritization thing is, that means that you're taking everything into consideration, right? You're thinking about your business value, thinking about customer value, thinking about what engineers can do, what can you build quickly, what can you not do something, what are your data constraints, these pipelines are going to fail, why am I building this? And being on that track and being able to voice that and communicate that over and over and over again is, I think, are three like just immutable qualities that I look for. The rest is a bonus, right? It's like, do you have knowledge about the industry? Are you reading constantly? Are you paying attention to what's happening in the market? Are you borrowing ideas? Innovation and that X thinking, as I call it, are all factors that, if you get it, great. If you don't get it, then at least you have these core qualities you can build on.
It's also kind of domain specific, where you might change that up a little bit depending on
100%
what organization you're hiring a team for. So what are some attributes you think about product folks that would find it really exciting to work on your team right now?
I think the biggest thing that we have is your impact. Anything that you touch right now that we're building will have hundreds of millions of dollars of impact right away, right? And as you get more and more senior in your career, I feel like you should be thinking about what your contribution to the world is, right? What is it that you're building, and why are you building this, and how can you have a big impact? And things that I was talking about, right? Tinkering out with AI and ML. Everyone talks a good game, but here we are having lots of valuable data, and I can actually have people work on it immediately to build products that allow you to use cutting edge technology in solving real world problems. I think that's something that's I would consider anybody with a curious mind to be excited about.
This is, maybe I shouldn't admit this. I already have, maybe, where I have a weakness, and maybe we all do when it comes to hiring, because it's never all the boxes checked, and sometimes your gut comes into play. And for me, one thing that I know is a bias or a weakness is, if someone has been working in lean manufacturing before, or understands kind of theory of constraints, if they've read The Goal, I tend to kind of overlook some other things in terms of experience and stuff in their resume, because I feel like if they understand this mindset, they can learn it fast. And that's the path I took, so I know how to teach them how I learned. So I'm curious for you if there's any things like that.
Yeah, the biggest thing I look for is structured thinking. So when in an interview, doesn't matter what your experience is, what your resume says, in a conversation, I will definitely go to like a very simple, like product building white space exercise, right? I'll always say, can you build a $100 million product for senior care, right? It's one of my favorite topics to like ask about. And the reason I ask this question is that if I give you complete white space, and maybe you don't have a senior that you've interacted with in recent times, but you have a general idea, you're getting older, so there could be problems. So there's a natural empathy. But then also, how do you take this complete white space problem and break it down into chunks that can actually be solved, right? What is the way you approach a big problem? I need to see that, because that kind of structured logical thinking can absolutely be taught, right? You can learn it. But to come with that and say that, hey, I've thought about all these things on the fly as I'm talking to you in an interview, for me, that shows your, temerity, right? Like the fearlessness of being able to approach something with just general curiosity. I don't know everything, but I'll ask the questions and we'll figure it out together. I think for me, it's just like demonstrates so much, right? Like openness, wanting to learn, wanting to ask the right questions, demonstrating empathy, like all of those things. So I think what you said is bang on. The idea that, hey, you have like some understanding of supply chain, great. Like I understand, the terminology and things like that. Like somebody asked us recently, like, what is a UPC? And I just like fell off my chest, like how you're working in supply chain and you don't know what UPC is, right? But then translating it to like these kind of just core abilities of product thinking, right? Can you be a structured thinker or not? So, yeah.
Totally. And that's a hard thing to teach. So it's probably not something you want to take on. That being said, I'm curious if you find the folks who have the right mindset and the right instincts, and you think, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of risk because I think the stuff that they don't have here, I can go teach. Is there any product related training or places that you would point people to get some of those teachable things learned?
Yeah, I think like I definitely think the Reforge courses are very good. And, I'm a big fan of Lenny Rechitsky's podcast. I think each of those podcasts is just like a case study in itself. And I think that if you're actively working in product leadership, it's really good to hear perspectives from other product leaders. So I followed that very effectively. And then Marty Kagan's books and courses, those things, I think just fundamentally like just start off with, some basic understanding of it. At Pepsi, we started a product management forum within the organization itself because everyone does it differently. So can we actually help each other out and share some best practices? Then, I've outside of Pepsi, we brought in like external speakers to speak about what they have done in terms of growing product management culture in different companies. So I think all of those resources typically, have hopefully helped everybody like advance a little bit further, right? The way I think about it is if you attend a talk or if you like listen to somebody, if there are literally three things that I didn't know before the conversation that I took away from that conversation, it was time well spent, right? And I have that principle for attending a conference or attending a webinar or like listening to a podcast. The best you can hope for is like three things that you will remember long term in your life.
We'll make sure to get a lot of those in the show notes. I have a question around starting a forum. We do that with tech leads as well as product folks, especially at big organizations, like you said, when folks do it differently, but at least not necessarily trying to convince everyone to work the same way, but giving everyone a safe space to share their differences and their similarities and build relationships that they can ask for help. What's a way that you think is easy to get it, that's helped you with getting those started and driving adoption internally?
I think that usually it's mostly about like the need, right? If there is no defined topic or no defined, speaker, let's say, then you can't rally people around, right? And this is like when I started Advancing Women in Product, this is a nonprofit that I started many years ago. I remember the very first talk that we did was a panel discussion on how to enter into product management. And I had sought a speaker from Google Maps, somebody from Facebook. I was at Amazon Alexa, and some person was from an executive at a startup, right? And just the panel definition alone attracted so many people to come in and participate, right? They left that conversation with value, right? It was like same thing that we talked about initially. Credibility is all in performance. Any forum can become a free for all unless you corral it around at least one topic, right? If you and I had to talk, we can talk for like a week, and I don't think we would exhaust all the topics there are in product management or technology or wherever. But if we start to like point at things that saying, hey Ashok, how do you think about conducting an effective meeting, right? Like let's say that was the topic we chose. I can leave that 30-minute meeting hoping that I gained something out of that discussion. So I think typically I've used both online and offline, right? Offline means Slack to create like a channel. but online mostly being structured about and being very intentional and specific about exactly what you want to solve, right? There's so many things in my day to day that I can't solve, but like maybe some help here would be great, and then saying, how can we solve it? So I think as a leader of these kind of forums, it always boils down to like creating that initial starting point with structure and then hoping for people's input so they can emulate that structure because everybody needs some level of leadership and guidance.
Awesome. I've got a last couple of questions that I like to ask all my guests. One of them is circling back to what you brought up earlier, where this product mindset is something that isn't just for software and has existed well before software, and we can bring into our personal lives as well. Anything that comes to mind that, you might get teased about by non-product folks of like, oh, are you doing your work thing here?
Yeah, I mean, I do I say things like context switching a lot, right? I'll be like, like, hey guys, we'll cause burnout if we keep switching topics over and over again. So I think things like that. And then like, just, managing your social calendar to have like the best energy for the best events, and then knowing how to decompress and plan activities around that. I think that's really helpful. My career management also, I think I've done it repeatedly where I'd have set a 2-year goal and work my way backwards from the 2-year goal and say, what are all the things that I can do today to achieve that 2-year goal? And then that cumulatively obviously ends up being in your 5 to 10-year goal, right? Which is a whole other podcast, I think. But I think I used product management for that approach as well.
I was thinking the exact same thing, that there's probably a whole other episode at least one more that we can have you come back on for. Last question for you. Whether at home or at work, what is a product or a service recently that just totally blew your socks off, you were really delighted by?
This is going to sound pretty like crazy, but like the Dyson Airwrap, I think like I'm obsessed with it. I've never been a beauty girl. I've never been into makeup or hair or anything. And then suddenly the pandemic hit and I got into the little, YouTube shorts and like the Instagram reels around these topics. And then somebody gifted me one and I started using it. And I just love how beautifully it's made, right? It's very clean interface, simple to understand, even for a novice like me, and the results are phenomenal. So
what is it?
It's a hair dryer.
Okay.
And it's got different contraptions, right? I mean, you have great hair, so I'm sure you can use it. And then you just put the thing and blow dry your hair, and then you remove it and put another contraption on it, and it takes like 10 minutes. And you have long flowy waves. And I thought that was pretty great recently.
Well, I will have to check it out.
Yeah.
Appreciate the compliment on the hair and just all of your generosity with your time today and with your instincts and your advice for our guests. Thanks a lot for making time.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.